There is a particular quality to silence in a small California town on a summer afternoon, thick, golden, and deceiving in its stillness. The kind of silence that wraps itself around ordinary things: a screen door left unlatched, a garden hose curled like a sleeping snake on brown grass, a red plastic bicycle leaned at a lazy angle against a chain-link fence. The kind of silence that, in hindsight, people describe as the last moment before everything changed. On the morning of July 14, 2009, in the sun-bleached town of Ridgecrest, California, population just over 28,000, nestled at the edge of the Mojave Desert, an 8-year-old boy named Mason Reed walked out of his family's backyard through a rusted gate and did not come back. He was wearing a green dinosaur t-shirt, faded blue shorts, and one white sock with a hole at the left toe. He had eaten a bowl of cereal for breakfast. He had kissed his mother on the cheek. He had said, according to those who were there, absolutely nothing unusual. 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days later, Mason Reed was found alive. But the question that would define those 11 years, the question that would hollow out a family, divide a community, and ultimately bring a man in a gray suit to stand before a jury, was never simply, where did Mason go? The question was always, who took him there? To understand what happened to Mason Reed, you first have to understand what Ridgecrest looked like in the summer of 2009. The town sits in the Indian Wells Valley, surrounded by the kind of open desert landscape that feels eternal and indifferent, flat expanses of pale sand interrupted by Joshua trees and the occasional ridge of dark volcanic rock. In July, daytime temperatures routinely climbed past 100 degrees. Families spent their mornings outside before the heat drove them indoors by noon. Children played early and hard. The Reed family lived on Coronado Avenue, a quiet residential street lined with modest ranch-style homes and mature oleander bushes. The father, Gary Reed, was 41 years old that summer, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and calloused hands who worked as a facilities supervisor at the Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake, the military installation that functioned as both the town's economic engine and its identity. Gary was known at work as dependable and methodical. He coached his son's little league team on Tuesday evenings. He barbecued on Sundays. Neighbors described him as reserved but pleasant, the kind of man who waved from his driveway but never lingered in conversation. Sandra Reed was 38, a part-time bookkeeper for a local hardware store chain and the family's gravitational center. Where Gary was quiet, Sandra was warm, the kind of mother who remembered every child's birthday in the neighborhood, who kept a bowl of wrapped candy on the porch, who could tell by the sound of footsteps on the front walk whether her son was happy or troubled. Those who knew her described Sandra as a woman whose whole life was organized around her family's daily rhythms. She knew Mason's moods before he could name them. Mason himself, Mason Christopher Reed, 8 years old as of the previous April, was the kind of child who left an impression. Small for his age, with a gap-toothed smile, dark hair that curled at the back of his neck in the heat, and an intense fascination with dinosaurs that bordered on scholarly. He carried a worn copy of a dinosaur encyclopedia everywhere. He could tell you the difference between a Brachiosaurus and a Brontosaurus before he could reliably tie his shoes. His second-grade teacher, Patricia Hollowell, would later tell investigators that Mason was one of those children who seemed older than his years in his curiosity, but entirely, sweetly innocent in his trust of the world. The morning of July 14th began like most summer mornings on Coronado Avenue. The sky was already hard and blue by 7:30, the kind of sky that promises heat without apology. Sandra had made oatmeal and then switched to cereal when Mason wrinkled his nose, frosted flakes, half a bowl, with the milk he always left unfinished. Gary had already left for work by 6:15. His shift at China Lake began early. Sandra was in the kitchen at 8:20, the radio on low, a country station she kept for background noise. When Mason finished breakfast, pushed back his chair with a scraping sound she would later describe to investigators in precise detail, said, "I'm going to look for lizards," and went out through the back door. The back door, that detail would matter. The Reeds' backyard was a modest rectangle, patchy grass, a swing set with one broken rubber seat that Gary had been meaning to replace since the previous summer, a low cinderblock wall along the back edge, and beyond that wall, a narrow dirt alley that ran behind the row of properties. The rusted gate in the cinderblock wall had a latch that Sandra believed locked from the outside. It did not, as investigators would later confirm. It had never locked reliably from either side. Clear's throat. Sandra did not look out the window when Mason went outside. She washed the breakfast dishes. She folded a basket of laundry. She called her sister briefly, a conversation that cell records would later timestamp beginning at 8:47 a.m. and lasting 11 minutes. When she hung up and looked out the kitchen window, the backyard was empty. The swing hung still. The toy truck Mason had left in the dirt the day before lay on its side. The gate in the cinder block wall stood slightly ajar. Sandra called Mason's name from the back steps, then louder from the alley. Then she walked to the front of the house and called again, scanning the quiet street. Two neighbors were outside, retired schoolteacher Donna Marsh, watering her roses, and 17-year-old Cody Barlow from 3 doors down, fiddling with his bicycle chain. Neither had seen Mason that morning. Neither had heard anything unusual. Sandra called Gary's cell phone at 9:22 a.m. He did not answer. He was in a facility inspection. She called again at 9:31. He answered on the third ring. According to Gary's account, relayed consistently across multiple interviews over the following years, Sandra was calm but concerned. She told him Mason had gone out back and hadn't come home. Gary told her to check with the neighbors and he'd be home by lunch. She called the Kern County Sheriff's Department at 9:47 a.m. The responding deputy, a 14-year veteran named Marcus Thibodeaux, arrived on Coronado Avenue at 10:15. He would later write in his incident report, "Residents contacted mother, Sandra Reed, visibly distressed but coherent. Child described as age 8, dark hair, green dinosaur shirt, blue shorts. Last seen in rear yard approximately 8:30 hours. Rear gate unlocked and ajar at time of arrival. No signs of altercation in yard. Father contacted, en route from workplace." Thibodeaux began a preliminary canvass of the immediate neighborhood within the hour. Gary Reed arrived home at 11:40. He explained, needed to complete a handoff of his morning duties before leaving the facility. He parked his gray pickup in the driveway. He walked up the front path. Those who were present would later note that he did not run. By the afternoon of July 14th, what had begun as a neighborhood canvass had expanded into something larger and louder. The Kern County Sheriff's Department coordinated with the Ridgecrest Police Department to organize a formal search effort. Volunteer teams, neighbors, church groups, off-duty military personnel from China Lake fanned out through the alleys, open lots, and adjacent desert terrain that bordered the residential neighborhoods on the town's eastern edge. Cadaver-trained search dogs worked the dry washes and scrub brush. A helicopter made low passes over the Indian Wells Valley floor as the afternoon heat shimmered off the sand. The search was thorough by any regional standard. Over the first 72 hours, more than 300 volunteers participated in organized grid searches, covering nearly 40 square miles of desert terrain. Flyers were printed, laminated, and posted on every telephone pole, storefront, and bulletin board within 20 miles. Mason's school photograph, that gap-toothed smile, the dinosaur encyclopedia tucked under one arm, appeared on local television news by the evening of July 14th and on regional broadcasts by July 15th. The community response was, by all accounts, immediate and heartfelt. Ridgecrest was a military town, accustomed to a culture of collective responsibility. People showed up. People brought water and sandwiches to the search staging area. People drove slowly through their own neighborhoods calling Mason's name through open car windows. A candlelight vigil at Ridgecrest Regional Park on the evening of July 16th drew several hundred residents. Gary Reed stood at that vigil beside Sandra. He held a candle. He spoke briefly into a microphone when the organizer offered it, thanked the community, asked anyone with information to come forward. Those who were standing nearby that evening would later describe his demeanor differently, depending on who was asked. Some said he appeared devastated, hollowed out. Others chose different words. Those who had known Gary for years said he looked the way Gary always looked: composed, controlled, impenetrable. Sandra, by contrast, was visibly shattered. She wept openly. She clutched the photographs of Mason that volunteers carried. She gripped the arm of her sister, who had driven in from Bakersfield on the first day. "She looked like someone had unplugged her," said Donna Marsh, the neighbor with the rose garden. "Like the person who used to be Sandra wasn't there anymore." Clear's throat. The first inconsistencies emerged quietly, the way they often do, not as accusations, not as revelations, but as small details that didn't align with other small details. They accumulated in the margins of investigators' notebooks. They were whispered about in the parking lot after briefings. Deputies, speaking years later, would describe them as a series of things that each, alone, meant nothing. Together, they began to form a shape. The first was the gate. Gary Reed told investigators in his first interview on July 14th that the back gate was always kept latched and that Mason had been told never to open it alone. Sandra confirmed this. But three neighbors, including Donna Marsh and a man named Robert Fuentes, who lived directly behind the Reeds across the alley, independently told investigators that they had frequently seen Mason in the alley on his own, that the gate was routinely left unlatched, and that this was not unusual. The second was the timeline. Gary's cell phone records, obtained within the first week, showed that he had received Sandra's first call at 9:22 and her second at 9:31. They showed a third call at 9:43, 4 minutes before Sandra called the sheriff's department. Gary had not mentioned a third call in his initial interview. When investigators asked about it in a follow-up session 3 days later, Gary said he had received it but hadn't answered because he was wrapping up the inspection handoff. The call lasted, according to records, 47 seconds, long enough for a voicemail, but no voicemail had been left. The third was the truck. Gary's gray pickup, a 2006 Ford F-150, had been parked in the employee lot at China Lake since Gary's arrival at 6:20 that morning. Security footage confirmed the truck entering the facility at 6:21. What it did not show, because the Eastern Service exit camera had been offline for maintenance since July 11th, was whether the truck had left and returned during the morning. Gary's supervisor confirmed Gary had been present for a 7:00 team briefing. The next visual confirmation of Gary on facility grounds was a security badge swipe at the Eastern Building entrance at 10:55 a.m., the point at which he began preparing to leave for home. Between 7:00 and 10:55, a window of approximately 3 hours and 55 minutes existed with no direct documentation of Gary Reed's whereabouts. Investigators noted the odometer reading on the truck when they examined it on July 17th. They compared it against Gary's stated routine, his commute, his known errands, his weekly routines. The numbers did not match their calculations. The discrepancy was small, 31 miles. But in a town 20 minutes across, 31 miles is not nothing. Those who have ever looked at a map and tried to make numbers cooperate with someone's story know the particular unease of that moment. One investigator would later say, speaking without attribution to a regional journalist covering the case, "The numbers didn't lie. They just didn't confirm." The physical evidence gathered in those first weeks was frustratingly sparse. No clothing, no blood, no hair samples that could not be attributed to Mason's routine movement through the yard. The alley behind the house offered tire marks, but the soft desert dust that served as its surface was crossed daily by multiple vehicles, delivery trucks, residents, maintenance crews, and no single set of marks could be isolated as significant. The search dogs hit on a scent trail that moved from the back gate into the alley, and then appeared to terminate at the roadway approximately 40 yards to the north. The handler noted in her report that this was consistent with a child entering a vehicle at that location. No one on the street recalled seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked in the alley that morning. Gary Reed submitted to a voluntary polygraph examination on July 22nd. The results were, in the language of the official report, inconclusive. Deputies whispered quietly in the hallways of the Ridgecrest substation. Investigators who had worked missing child cases before recognized the shape of what they were looking at. But recognition is not evidence. Suspicion is not proof. The case, without a body, without a witness, without physical evidence that could anchor a charge, began to slow. By September 2009, the organized search operations had wound down. The flyers on the telephone poles faded in the desert sun and peeled at the corners. Mason Reed's case was transferred to the sheriff's cold case unit in January 2010, 18 months after the investigators had hoped it would be. The file was thick and inconclusive. The boy had vanished in the bright morning of a California summer, and the desert, indifferent as ever, had offered nothing back. The time moves differently inside a grief that has no resolution. There is no burial to organize, no obituary to write, no moment of formal ending that allows the process of mourning to begin. Families of missing children exist in a particular kind of suspended state, a permanent, exhausting vigil that demands both hope and devastation simultaneously, that requires them to be ready at any moment for a phone call that might never come. Sandra Reed moved through the months after Mason's disappearance in the way people describe surviving a flood, methodically, room by room, inch by inch above the waterline. She returned to her part-time bookkeeping work in the autumn of 2009, in part because the routine gave her days a shape, in part because the medical bills associated with the investigation-adjacent expenses. The private investigator she hired briefly, the counseling sessions, the travel to meet with advocacy groups, had begun to accumulate. She joined the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Family Support Network. She maintained a Facebook page for Mason, updating it on his birthdays and the anniversaries of his disappearance with the school photograph, and a message asking for anyone with information to come forward. The page accumulated followers slowly over the years, eventually in the thousands, drawn by the kind of quiet, persistent grief that the internet has a way of amplifying. Clears throat. Gary Reed remained in the house on Coronado Avenue through the end of 2009. Those who saw him during that period described a man who had retreated entirely into himself, working his regular shifts, maintaining the house, speaking little. He continued attending church, where the congregation had organized the initial prayer vigil. The pastor, Reverend David Alcott, would later describe Gary as a man who appeared to be enduring rather than living. He sat in the same pew every Sunday, Alcott recalled. He never cried, not once that I saw. I told myself at the time that people grieve differently. I told myself that for a long time. The marriage deteriorated in the specific, slow way that marriages deteriorate under unspoken pressure. Not in arguments, not in dramatic confrontations, but in silences that grew longer and colder, in rooms that began to feel like separate territories, in the gradual withdrawal of the small gestures that hold two people together. Sandra would later describe to a journalist the moment she understood the marriage was ending. She had found, tucked in the back of Gary's dresser drawer in early 2010, a photograph of Mason. Not a recent photograph, one from Mason's 5th birthday, 3 years before the disappearance. She had not seen the photograph before. She stood in the bedroom holding it for several minutes. She could not articulate then, or later, exactly what the finding of that photograph meant to her. Only that it changed something in how she looked at the man she had married. Gary moved out of the house on Coronado Avenue in March 2010. He rented a small apartment on the north side of town, closer to the China Lake facility. He retained a lawyer shortly after, not a criminal defense attorney, but a civil attorney. He cited the separation amicably to those who asked and said little about the investigation. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, who have sat across a kitchen table from a familiar face and felt, for the first time, the cold vertigo of not being certain, there is a kind of secondary grief in Sandra Reed's story that is almost impossible to fully describe. She did not accuse Gary publicly. She did not speak to the press about her suspicions. But she had a child who was gone, and a husband who had left, and a house that held both absences equally. Mason's bedroom remained unchanged for several years. Sandra has spoken publicly about this, how she kept his dinosaur encyclopedia on the nightstand, how she washed his sheets periodically even though no one slept in the bed, how she left the Constellation nightlight plugged into the wall socket beside the closet. "It was the only thing I could control," she said in a 2015 interview with a documentary filmmaker who was compiling a broader piece on cold cases of missing children. Keeping his room ready, in case. Small revealing moments accumulated across those years. Sandra's sister, Patricia Morno, who visited regularly from Bakersfield, described noticing changes in Sandra that she found difficult to name. Sandra had begun drawing obsessively in notebooks she kept by the bed. Not artistic drawings, maps. The same map over and over. Coronado Avenue, the alley behind the house, the route Gary would have driven to work. Lines and distances and question marks. She was doing what the investigators should have kept doing, Patricia said quietly. She was trying to solve it herself. In 2013, 4 years after Mason's disappearance, Sandra Reed relocated to Bakersfield to be closer to her sister. She kept the Facebook page active. She checked it every day. She attended annual rallies for missing children organized by advocacy groups in Sacramento. She sent annual letters to the Kern County Sheriff's Department Cold Case Unit asking for updates. The responses were courteous and uninformative. Gary Reed's life during these same years followed a different arc. He remained in Ridgecrest, received a promotion at China Lake in 2011, and began a new relationship in 2012 with a woman named Connie Adler, a nurse he had met through the church where he had continued attending services. Those who knew him during this period described a man who appeared, on the surface, to have rebuilt himself a steady job, stable relationship, respectable standing in the community. He did not speak publicly about Mason. When asked by coworkers or acquaintances about his son, he would offer a brief, appropriate expression of hope and redirect the conversation. Those who pressed further reported that he became still in a particular way, not hostile, not defensive, simply still, as if something inside him had learned very early to stop moving when it felt observed. The cold case file gathered dust in the Kern County records system. The assigned detective, a methodical man named Vincent Acaffer who had taken over the case in 2011, reviewed it periodically and maintained contact with a handful of witnesses. He submitted a funding request in 2014 for forensic reanalysis of several items that had been collected from the Reed property in the initial investigation, items that had been tested with 2009 technology and might yield more information with updated methods. The request was approved in 2015. The results came back in early 2016. They were not conclusive, but they were not nothing either. A partial mitochondrial profile recovered from a fiber sample found near the back gate in 2009, previously dismissed as uninterpretable, was reanalyzed against an updated reference database. It did not match Mason. It did not match Sandra. It did not match any of the neighbors who had been asked to provide exclusionary samples in 2009. The fiber sample had not been matched to Gary Reed in 2009 because Gary Reed had not been asked to provide a sample at that time. He had been asked. He had agreed. The sample had been collected and logged. And then, in the confusion and volume of the initial investigation, it had been mislabeled and associated with the wrong case file number. It had sat in a Ridgecrest evidence locker for 7 years, cross-referenced to a vandalism case from 2008. Detective Acaffer discovered the mislabeling in February 2016 during a routine audit of evidence associated with the Reed case. He sat in his office for a long time after he made the discovery. Then he picked up the phone. The trigger, when it finally came, did not arrive through forensic science or investigative breakthrough alone. It arrived in the form of a 17-year-old boy sitting in a counselor's office at a high school in Victorville, California, approximately 90 miles south of Ridgecrest, on a Thursday afternoon in October 2020. The boy's name was Kyle Adler Reed. He had been enrolled at Victor Valley High School under that name for 2 years. Before that, he had lived under a different name in a different city. Before that, he had lived briefly in Nevada. Before all of that, he had been a child named Mason Reed who had eaten a bowl of frosted flakes on a summer morning and gone out the back door to look for lizards. The school counselor, Dr. Aisha Brennan, was a licensed clinical social worker with 14 years of experience working with adolescents. She had been meeting with Kyle, as she knew him, for approximately 3 weeks, after he was referred by a teacher who had noted signs of significant anxiety and social withdrawal. In their session on October 8, 2020, Kyle said something that Dr. Brennan would later describe in her written account to authorities as delivered quietly, almost matter-of-factly, as if he had been carrying it for so long it had become just a weight he was used to. Kyle said, "I think my name is actually Mason. I think I was in the news when I was little. I think someone is looking for me." Dr. Brennan followed mandated reporter protocol precisely and without delay. She notified Child Protective Services and the Victorville Police Department the same afternoon. By the following morning, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department had contacted the Kern County Sheriff's Department, and Detective Vincent Acaffer, who had been following the Reed cold case for 9 years by this point, received a phone call at 7:12 a.m. on October 9, 2020, that he would later describe as the kind of call you wait for and never fully believe will actually come. The identification process was handled carefully. A DNA sample was obtained from Kyle Adler Reed and compared against the DNA profile on file for Mason Christopher Reed. The results, returned on October 14, 2020, confirmed with scientific certainty that Kyle Adler Reed and Mason Reed were the same person. Mason was 19 years old. He had aged out of the childhood photograph that still circulated on Sandra Reed's Facebook page. He was alive. He was healthy, physically. He was sitting in a counselor's office, trying to put into words 11 years of a life constructed around a lie. Mason Kyle had been living with Gary Reed and Connie Adler in various locations since 2009. After leaving Ridgecrest in 2010, Gary had relocated first to Las Vegas, Nevada, then to Barstow, California, then to Victorville. He had enrolled the child in school under the name Kyle, using documentation that investigators would later determine had been obtained through a network of fraudulent records, birth certificates, immunization records, and school enrollment forms constructed with meticulous care over the course of months before Mason's disappearance. Gary Reed had not acted impulsively on July 14, 2009. He had planned. The motive, as it emerged through investigation and eventual testimony, centered on a custody dispute that had never become a formal legal proceeding. Gary and Sandra had been experiencing serious marital difficulties in the year before Mason's disappearance: arguments, separations, discussions of divorce. Gary had, according to Sandra's later testimony and corroborating statements from family members, expressed repeatedly and with intensity his belief that in any custody arrangement, Sandra would be awarded primary custody. "He told me once," Sandra said during a victim impact statement, "that he would never allow a court to tell him when he could see his own child. I thought he meant it as frustration. I didn't hear it as a plan." Gary Reed was arrested on October 16, 2020, at the residence in Victorville that he had shared with Connie Adler and Mason for the past 2 years. He was taken into custody by a joint team from the Kern County Sheriff's Department, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, and an FBI agent assigned to the case under the federal parental abduction statutes. Arrest records describe Gary as cooperative at the time of arrest. He did not resist. He did not run. He stood in the doorway of his home for a long moment, looking at the officers assembled on the walkway, and then he stepped outside and placed his hands behind his back. Connie Adler was also detained for questioning. Investigators would later determine that she had become aware of Mason's true identity approximately 3 years into the relationship, around 2015, and had not reported it. She reached a cooperation agreement with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. The media coverage that followed the arrest was immediate and overwhelming. The story carried the particular emotional power of a resolution that had arrived so long after anyone expected it that it felt almost mythological. The missing child, found. The deception, unraveled. The mother, after 11 years, finally receiving the phone call she had kept her phone charged to receive. National news organizations ran the story within hours of the arrest. Social media amplified it across platforms. Sandra Reed's Facebook page for Mason, which had accumulated thousands of followers over the years, received hundreds of thousands of reactions in a single day. Sandra learned that Mason was alive from Detective Ockhaffer, who drove personally to Bakersfield to deliver the news. She has described the moment publicly, carefully, in terms that resist easy sentimentality, not because the moment was not emotional, but because the emotions were not simple. "It wasn't just happiness," she told a documentary filmmaker. "It was happiness and grief at the same time, because I had missed him. I had missed 11 years of him. He was alive, and I was grateful beyond anything I can express. And those 11 years were still gone." The reunion between Sandra and Mason took place under the supervision of a family therapist, in a structured setting, approximately 3 weeks after the arrest. It is not a moment that either of them has described publicly in detail. What is known is that Mason, who had been told, for most of his life, a version of his history in which Sandra had been a distant and unreachable figure, arrived at that meeting with a therapist at his side and a folder of questions he had written down and wanted answered. Sandra arrived with a worn copy of the gap-toothed school photograph she had carried for 11 years. They sat across from each other in a small, quiet room, and they began. Gary Reed faced multiple charges across 2 jurisdictions, including felony parental abduction, custodial interference, and false imprisonment. The last charge pertaining to the sustained nature of the concealment and the period during which Mason, as he grew older, had expressed to Gary a desire to seek out his mother and had been discouraged, controlled, and ultimately persuaded that doing so was either dangerous or futile. Prosecutors argued, and the jury ultimately agreed, that the psychological constraint placed on Mason as he aged constituted a form of ongoing confinement. The trial took place in Kern County Superior Court beginning in March 2022. It lasted 14 days. The gallery was full on every day of testimony. Sandra Reed sat in the front row on the prosecution's side. Gary Reed, in a gray suit, sat at the defense table and exhibited the same composed, impenetrable stillness that witnesses had described at the vigil in Ridgecrest 13 years earlier. Those who had believed in his innocence across those years, and there were some, even among people who had known the family, sat in the rows behind the defense table and watched his face for something that would help them understand. Mason Reed testified on the 4th day of trial. He was 21 years old by then, a young man with dark hair that still curled slightly at the back of his neck, who spoke to the jury in a measured voice that occasionally broke and then steadied itself. He testified about the morning of July 14, 2009, how his father had been in the alley when Mason came through the gate, had told him they were going on a surprise trip, had asked him not to tell Mom yet because it was a special adventure, had put him in the truck. He testified about the months that followed, the hotels, the new name, the explanation that his mother had agreed to this arrangement, that she was busy and had thought it was better this way. He testified about the gradual, painful recognition, somewhere around age 14, that the story did not hold together. He testified about finding his own face on a missing child website in 2017 during a late-night search on a school computer and sitting alone in a library carrel for a very long time before closing the browser window. He testified that his father had told him, when Mason was approximately 16 and had directly confronted him, that going back would destroy the family they had built, that Sandra did not want him back, that investigators had moved on, that Mason returning would cause more harm than good. He said, "She has a whole new life, Kyle. She doesn't need this," Mason told the jury. "And I was 16. I didn't know enough yet to know that was wrong." The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was returned on March 28, 2022. Guilty on all counts. Gary Reed stood when the verdict was read. He remained still. He turned once to look at the gallery, a brief, sweeping look that moved across the room without appearing to settle on any particular face, and then he turned back to face the judge. He was sentenced to 11 years in state custody, with the possibility of parole after 6. The sentence was received in the courtroom with silence from both sides of the gallery. The only sound was a quiet, sustained exhale from the direction of the front row. Outside the courthouse, on the broad concrete steps in the March sunlight, Sandra Reed stood beside her sister and briefly answered questions from reporters. She spoke carefully, as she always had. She said that what mattered was not the sentence, though she respected the jury's work. What mattered was that Mason was real and present and building his life. What mattered was that the question that had organized 11 years of her existence, had finally been answered. She did not name Gary Reed in her statement. She did not describe him. She spoke only of her son. There are cases that change the way we understand what is possible between people, not the extraordinary violence of stranger crime that fills most true crime narratives, but the quieter, more intimate betrayal of trust that occurs inside the families we build around ourselves. The disappearance of Mason Reed was not, in the end, the work of a stranger with malicious intent toward a child he did not know. It was the work of a father who loved his son in a way that could not be separated from his need to possess and control what he loved. That distinction does not diminish what was done to Mason. It does not diminish the 11 years Sandra Reed spent holding a phone charged and ready. It does not diminish the childhood Mason lost, the adolescence spent living a borrowed name, the years of not knowing how to begin the story of his own life, because he did not know where it had actually started. What the case of Mason Reed asks us to consider is not the obvious question of guilt or justice. Those were settled, in their way, on March 28, 2022. It asks us to consider the smaller, harder questions. How long can a lie be sustained before it becomes the only truth a child knows? How many people pass through our communities holding a question they don't know how to ask? How many school counselors, teachers, neighbors, coaches have sat across from a child who was trying, in the only ways available to them, to let the world know something was wrong? Mason Reed was 19 years old when he sat in Dr. Aisha Brennan's office and said, quietly, that he thought someone might be looking for him. He had been trying to find a way to that sentence for at least 5 years. The world was fortunate that, when he finally found it, someone was listening.